and Balmer, and good thing it only comes once a year. My liver can't handle all those hats and all those free drinks and all that stuff. Luke Jones joins us now to discuss the offseason of the Purple Birds. I'm wearing my Curio purple sweater here, but lots of purple sweaters coming in, including a familiar face, and Pernell McPhee, who was always one of our favorites to chat with as well, back in the fold here, and we've been wondering who's going to chase the quarterback around. Well, Eric DeCosta's not done, right, Luke?
That's right, and I think the key word that comes to mind when you look at these signings, Pernell McPhee, Shane Ray, Michael Floyd on the wide receiver side, is competition. I don't think any of these guys are a sure thing necessarily. I mean, Pernell McPhee is coming off of a season where he had 0 sacks. Shane Ray had 1. Michael Floyd had 10 catches last year. But
there's better be a bounce back year for these. We tried to sign Michael Floyd, 10 years ago?
Yeah, Michael Floyd. I mean,
was that 2008? What year was that? Was that after Mason, after Bolden, or which one was that? But I know we were going after Michael Floyd at one point, right?
Yeah, well, Michael Floyd, of course, a former first-round pick of the Arizona Cardinals, had some success there, but he was always overshadowed by Fitzgerald and whoever else might have been in the mix at that point. But I think the overall message that Eric DeCosta is sending here is they're not just going to hand snaps to young guys blindly. I mean, we've spent so much time this offseason talking about Tyus Bowser and Tim Williams, 2 guys that were day 2 picks in 2017, 2 guys who have done very little to distinguish themselves to this point in their NFL career. Part of that was lack of opportunity because they had Zadarius Smith and Terrell Suggs and Matt Judon ahead of them. Well, now you subtract 2 of those 3 from the equation, but the fact that the Ravens have pursued edge rushers throughout the offseason, whether we're talking about Justin Houston at the very beginning, Ziggy Ansah recently, they certainly would have been interested in edge rushers had they fallen in the first round to them, say a Burns in the first round, who they didn't have the opportunity to draft. So you look at, they pick up Jalen Ferguson, of course, in the 3rd round, and they like him. They like the value they got from him as someone who put up big numbers in his collegiate career. And now you add 2 guys who maybe can help you. But the whole point is all of these guys, other than Matt Judon at this point, and we're not talking about a guy who's had a 15-sack season even in Matt Judon. I mean, a guy who's been a good, solid, dependable pass rusher the last couple of years, but hasn't put up big sack numbers. But you're hoping of all these guys now, you've thrown 3 more into the mix with Ferguson, the rookie, McPhee and Ray, the veterans, and between Bowser and Tim Williams, if you can get some combination, say 3 of those 5 guys to contribute. And when I say contribute, I don't mean pick up 13 or 14 sacks apiece. If they can at least be part of the rotation, at least offer them something different. I think McPhee specifically brings them some extra value if he can add some inside pressure. I mean, he's going to be a situational guy. He was always at his best as a guy who was on a pitch count. I mean, that's why.
By the way, when they drafted him, they knew he had bad knees,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. That's why he's a fifth round.
Part of that is, we talked about that when he was a rookie. We talked about second contract. We talked about that the day that the Bears gave him all the money. All that stuff. It is fascinating that he's still playing, right? Like I always look at Peter Boulware's career as being the interesting guy, and I haven't talked to Pete in a while. Pete's one of the really magnificent people you'd ever want to meet. Just a wonderful guy, and how his body has changed. I texted with Mike Flynn over the weekend. He ordered some Costas crab cakes, And these guys that lose all the weight and they get their bodies back and all of that stuff. But then, then there's these guys with bad knees. McCrary being another guy, back in the day who was always trying to keep weight on and all that stuff. McPhee was one of those guys the day they drafted him. If they would have said he was still playing football in 2019, they would have been shocked by that. So the fact that he's at a second life and is going to come back here and run around, he's had a wonderful journey through the NFL for where he was on draft day, and I always liked him. And when they're going to sign him, the first thing I thought about was his knees, because they never thought his knees would make it to 30, literally.
Yeah, but I also think that's good reason to temper expectations. I mean, it's very well possible Pernell McPhee comes in and isn't one of their best 4 or 5 outside linebacker types and doesn't make the team.
Well, to your point, how many sacks last year, right? I mean, exactly.
0,
exactly.
Right. I mean, 0 in 13 games. Now, sacks aren't the end-all, be-all, but they're clearly an indication of how effective you are as a pass rusher. I mean, you can tally pressures, you can tally quarterback hits. I believe he had 8 quarterback hits last year. But, I mean, this was a guy who played enough with Washington to really make it clear that he wasn't the guy that he had been 3-4 years ago when he got the big contract in Chicago. And, that's why he was available.
Not all of us can improve the way you and I have,
Oh, yeah, right. but that's why he was available in mid-May. I mean, that's a good reminder for all of these guys. These are guys that are, at this point, reclamation projects. I mean, McPhee, if he can give them some inside rush that Zadarius Smith was able to do for them the last couple of years, if he can put some, even if it's just a case of putting some heat on Bowser, on Williams, on Ferguson coming in and knowing he needs to prove himself and not just showing up and expecting to play just because the depth chart's pretty light. I think that to me, more than anything with McPhee and with Shane Ray, is kind of the initial goal, and then you see what they can do. Shane Ray, I think, is probably someone who has more, I'll say definitely has more upside because he's younger. I mean, he just turned 26 years old over the weekend. The issue for him has been health. He's had, I think, 3 left wrist operations. He had a major wrist injury a couple years ago. He had an 8-sack season his second year in Denver, and at that point, it's looking like he's going to be the replacement to DeMarcus Ware and is going to be the nice bookend for Von Miller in that Broncos defense. And he's had 2 sacks over the last 2 seasons because the wrist has been an issue for him. Now, clearly, the Ravens, with their medical team looking at him, deemed him healthy enough to sign. That doesn't mean he's going to be the Shane Ray that he was in 2016, where he had 8 sacks and looked like he was on his way to maybe not being a Pro Bowler, but certainly being a guy that was an above-average pass rusher in this league. So, in the case of McPhee, it's about extracting whatever value he might have left. Not to be cruel, but he's 30 years old and he has bad knees, as you indicated. So whatever he might have left. In the case of Shane Ray, it's hoping that maybe that wrist is finally right, and if it is, you might have something that a guy that might not just help you this year, but maybe can be a part of your pass rush equation for the next couple years. But again, a guy who had 1 sack last year in 11 games, so you have to be realistic. And I think, again, we go back to this idea of competition. Other than Matt Judon, and again, Matt Judon has not had a double-digit sack season, so let's keep that in mind even. But with all of these guys, hypothetically speaking, Nestor, if you can get one of Tyus Bowser and Tim Williams to step forward, one of McPhee and Shane Ray works out, Jalen Ferguson gives them some contributions as a rookie, and Judon can, at the very least, be what he's been the last couple of years, which has been a solid to good pass rusher, then I think that combination gives you a pass rush that's good enough, especially when it's paired with what you expect to be a pretty elite secondary. That's where I think you just look at the math and you're hedging your bets. I mean, none of these guys is a sure thing in isolation, but when you place, when you buy enough lottery tickets, so to speak, you're improving your chances of winning, and I think that's what Eric DeCosta was able to do with these 2 signings from a pass rush standpoint. So I think it's, they're 1-year deals. I mean, there's no downside. I mean, if these guys can't play, then they won't make the team. I mean, I think it's that simple. I think the Ravens are envisioning them making the team, but they need to prove themselves. And again, if nothing else, it gives a little more motivation, a little more of a reminder to Bowser and Williams that, hey, just because Zadarius Smith and Terrell Suggs are no longer here and you're not stuck behind them on the depth chart, we're not just handing you snaps. You're going to have to earn it, and I think that's what you want. I mean, when you have a team that's in transition, a team that's undergone a lot of changes, as we've talked about, especially on the offensive side of the ball, it's great to say next man up. It's great to say that you envision rookies and younger guys stepping into those roles, but until they've proven it, you really don't want to just be handing them snaps. You want them to prove it at the very least in the preseason that they're deserving of that. And now, with the numbers that they have, you have competition. And I think it should be really interesting to see how this all plays out. And you're hoping that each of these guys kind of brings something different to the equation. Bowser's a guy that can drop into coverage a little more than the other guys. I mentioned McPhee sliding inside. Shane Ray is, more of that edge speed guy, coming from the outside. So you have some guys that can do some different things, but ultimately it needs to be productive. It needs to work. It needs to mesh. And I think with the numbers they have now, you feel a little bit better about it. Not that it's going to be an overwhelming, dominant pass rush, but you're hoping now that the probability is high enough now where you feel that you're going to be able to replace at least most of what they lost last year.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. We got tons of new sponsors around here. I want to give some love to our sponsors. I'm hoping you're doing that as well. They keep the engines on here. Roos Chris, our dear friend Steve DeCastro, the entire Series Stakes family, whether you're downtown at Pier 5, where I was over the weekend, Preakness week, make sure you're checking out Roos Chris, the $39.95 special. Happy hour at the bar. Stop by Pikesville, say hello. I'm going to be up there this week as well. Roos Chris, longtime sponsor, helping us fight leukemia as well. And hey, it's Roos Chris, enough said. Roos Chris means the best. It's a synonym. Also, Hammer and Nails, the Ultimate Man Cave Nirvana up there in Owings Mills. I would show you my hair on the webcam, but it's getting a little long right now. I'm getting it chopped on Wednesday. The Ultimate Man Cave Nirvana is in the town center. Manicure, pedicure, TVs, adult beverages, hot towels, shave, relax. Check out Hammer and Nails. I'll wear the shirt on the cam a little later on in the week as well. The Model Lyric. I saw John at the Preakness the other day. We've had him on the air here several times as well. Model Lyric lighting it up. Johnny Lang on July 11th, and I'm going for Bill Maher in a couple weeks, June 9th. That's a big weekend. Eddie B's doing comedy June 8th. He's the teacher. I dig that. JoJo Siwa on June 12th. I've had conversations about that. We had her on the program. And the Marvin Gaye musical, Pride and Joy, in June as well. I'm definitely going to that because, I'm a Marvin guy. Sporticulture, the flowers around me on the set can be yours. Go to Sporticulture. That's sporticulture.com. Our friends at Walnut Springs Nursery do it all of the flowers out at the Preakness. I'm still sneezing. Court and I get into that, man. Flowers make me sneeze, which is why Court got me a lava lamp. So we're going to have a lava lamp on the set here for football season, all brought to you by Sporticulture. Luke Jones is here. He is Baltimore Luke and Luke at WNST.net. All right, so Luke, I want to back up because 3 players, veteran players, track records, all that stuff. First things first. You spend $15 million on an edge rusher, you get what you get, right? You get a guy that's got 14 sacks, 16 sacks, or whatever, and that creates one kind of defense. I think here with the money and where they are and the availability and what Suggs represented in him leaving and all of that, and also through the draft and where they've been with the Bowsers and the Williams and part of this where Matt Judon is a superstar. Maybe this is an 18-sack year for him, and he's going to be a $20 million football player. Maybe they really believe that. Either way, this is about golf clubs in the bag, as you've pointed out, versatility. It's about guys who come in who aren't rookies, and Arthur Browns and can't figure out where to stand, and Matt Elam. These are guys that have been in another organization who've done this. And there's also the part where, well, hey, we didn't have to spend $15 million on this. We don't expect to have the best pass rush in the league. We expect to be multiple, though. And in this case, they've at least accomplished that. It's better than spending all that money on, let's say what the Green Bay Packers did in the offseason. We had an opportunity to do that. They didn't want to do that, right?
Yeah, I think you just have to look at it pragmatically. And look, if you have a Von Miller type, if you have a Khalil Mack type as a pass rusher coming off the edge, then God bless you. The Ravens had this in 2014 when Elvis Dumervil and Terrell Suggs combined for well over 20, I can't remember the exact total, but it was well over 20 sacks between them. They had a big year in 2014 from a sack total standpoint with just those 2 guys. But it doesn't just have to be one guy or 2 guys. As John Harbaugh talked about earlier this offseason, I remember you posing the question to him at the league meetings, what's more valuable, pressure or coverage on the back end in today's NFL? The overall sentiment.
God, you remember a question I asked? I don't remember asking it.
Yeah. I mean, but the overall sentiment in this day and age in today's NFL is coverage in the back end is more valuable because quarterbacks get rid of the ball so quickly. But the other thing that Harbaugh said in acknowledging that, clearly you want both. I mean, that's obvious, but you can also scheme up ways to get pressure. And we saw this a lot. I mean, look at how many sacks Patrick Owasso had last year. Look at how C.J. Mosley has had sacks in the past, not last year specifically, but times where he's had a few more sacks. I mean, there are different things you can do. We've seen Tavon Young blitz from the nickel and pick up a sack or two. I mean, that's just things that you can do. And I think in the case of this Ravens defense in 2019, no, you might not have a Zadarius Smith or Terrell Suggs picking up 7, 8, 9 sacks. We'll see what Judon can do. I mean, Judon had 7 this past year. He had 8 in 2017. Can he take it to another level, or is he in that territory again? But my point is, now that you have multiple guys in that edge rush conversation, now, not all of them are going to be able to play. I mean, you can only have so many in the rotation. You can only have so many on the game day roster. But if we learned anything about Wink Martindale last year, it was, one, they are going to scheme and use some exotic looks in the same way that Rex Ryan would in the past.
And you can do that when you have Eric Weddle and C.J. Mosley. You can do that when you have, Bart Scott and Ray Lewis and Ed Reed. You know what I mean? Literally, you have to have the players to do that, right?
Sure. But they did add an Earl Thomas to the mix. They still have some veterans on this team. Not as many, that's clear. But
it's nice having one guy that knows where everybody should be. You need to have 11.
Sure. But I think the other thing we learned about Wink Martindale is he loves to rotate players. I mean, look at how the Ravens handle their secondary. I mean, you typically see in the secondary, you'll have 4 guys who play ideally 100% of the snaps, or somewhere in the neighborhood of 95 to 100%. You have your nickel, but if you saw what the Ravens did last year, now, part of it was luxury, and they held on to that. I think that was deliberate. We talked a lot about Jimmy Smith being a cap casualty this year because we all saw the cap number, we saw the salary, we've all seen the lack of dependability in terms of him playing 16 games. It's happened very rarely in his career, but the Ravens held on to him. A reason why they value that depth in the secondary so much, because then they can rotate. And Marlon Humphrey and Brandon Carr and Jimmy Smith and Tavon Young and whoever else you want to throw into that equation, none of those guys have to play 100% of the snaps. So it keeps them fresh. It's the same principle that's been applied on the defensive line and with edge rushers for a long time now in the NFL, but the Ravens are applying that at every level. So I think because of having that depth in the secondary, they're going to be able to rotate, keep those guys fresh. They play a lot of man-to-man coverage. They're going to press a lot once again. And I think those are all things that will help this pass rush, and you're just going to be able to rotate guys. I mean, Matt Judon's not going to have to be on the field every single play. I'm betting he'll play more than any of those other edge rushers, but you can mix and match those guys. You can play situational football. You can slide McPhee inside, and we know that they're going to need someone to rush from the interior because they lost Zadarius Smith. They lost Brent Urban. So they have guys who can do different things and guys that are going to line up and play at various times in the game, and they're going to rotate. And it might be they might not have a guy with a double-digit sack total. I mean, they didn't have that this past year. But they had an effective pass rush. Why? Because they had multiple guys who could do it, and they could line up different ways, and they could scheme pressure and keep quarterbacks guessing, keep offensive linemen guessing, and there was enough there. Now, I'm not promising that they're going to be able to do that now, but adding the guys that they did, having more depth, having a little more versatility, giving a little bit of the proverbial kick in the butt to some of these younger guys that they're not just going to be handed a job. I think all of those things in concert increases the likelihood of the Ravens having a good enough pass rush. Doesn't mean it's going to be the best in the league or top 5, but I think it can be good enough, especially with that secondary. And as I wrote not too long ago at WNST.net, it's really going to test one of these football analytics principles of today, that pass rush is more valuable, or coverage is more valuable than pass rush.
Well, you can't spend $1 billion on everything, right? I mean,
right, you can't.
Everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, the strength of our team, as we've pointed out many, many times, is what? Our kicker. You know what I mean? Like, we spend more on that than anybody because it's important around here. We used to spend more on quarterback, right? Now, you have to figure out where you're going to spend your money. And to your point, maybe it was this journalist kicking around the organization for 5 straight off seasons about the lack of deep depth in the secondary, that now feels like, well, that's where they've spent time and attention and money because of things like Antonio Brown, who they don't have to worry about twice a year, but Odell Beckham, who they do have to worry about twice a year, right?
Right. And it's very clear, it's very apparent that the secondary has become, it's the deepest positional group on either side of the ball for this football team right now. And it's not even, I don't think it's close.
When's the last time we could say that, man? I mean, maybe McAllister, Starks, Herring, maybe for a minute or 3, but, and then Reed came in after that. I don't know. I mean, I can't ever remember saying we're loaded on the back end in the secondary because it was always Corey Ivy playing nickel or, that's just kind of the way the position has been. But to your point, this is where they feel like they're not going to lose a game in the fourth quarter the way they did every week 3 years ago.
Well, and the key there is, yes, you need some high quality, which they held on to Jimmy Smith. They drafted Marlon Humphrey 2 years ago in the first round. They spent some real money on Brandon Carr 2 off seasons ago. They've spent a lot of money at the safety position. I mean, think about it. They've given out a big contract at safety 3 of the last 4 off seasons. Look at the draft. I mean, for as much as you looked at the 3 drafts after they drafted Jimmy Smith, and, it was 5th and 7th round picks and guys who, Asa Jackson hung around for a minute but never really distinguished himself. Couldn't stay on the field. Wasn't very good when he was on the field. But starting with that 2015 draft, they've taken a corner in no later than the 4th round every single year. We've used the term, we've referenced the term that Mike Elias has used with having a talent pipeline that the Orioles are trying to figure out and hopefully will figure out at some point in the next few years. The Ravens have very clearly applied that same principle at the cornerback position where they're saying, we are not going to be left shorthanded. And we know that we're not going to draft an all-pro every single year, but if we're drafting a corner at least early on day 3 every year, and some years we're going to do earlier than that, like they did with Humphrey 2 years ago, then we feel pretty good about our depth. We feel pretty good that we're going to find some guys that can be starters, or at least guys that you can plug in if your starter gets hurt and you're not going to have colossal drop-off. And that's where they stand right now. I mean, look at this team's group of cornerbacks, and you have the top 3 that we talk about. We mentioned Tavon Young, who the Ravens paid. But even beyond them, they added Justin Bethel, who's a special teams guy, but he's played some corner in the league and has been okay. I think he's someone you could put in there and not completely fall apart by any means. Anthony Everett, I really liked a lot as a rookie last year. I think he's a guy that could be a starter for them in the next year or 2. And they added Amon Marshall, a guy who was a multiple-year starter at USC in the 4th round. And that's not even talking about guys like Maurice Kennedy, and Stanley Jean-Baptiste and Cyrus Jones. Those are all guys to me that they're going to have to make the team. I mean, Maurice Kennedy was their starting nickel 2 years ago in the second half of 2017, and at this point, Nestor, I'm not sure there's a path for a roster spot. Unless, and this is where we talk about the importance of the depth, unless you have an injury or 2 in the preseason. And, we know the Ravens were very fortunate in the injury department last year, but the few years before that, not so much. So they have very clearly said, we are not going to be left shorthanded at corner. Even if Jimmy Smith is making more than we'd like to pay him at this stage in his career, even if Brandon Carr is getting further and further away on the wrong side of 30, even if Marlon Humphrey, someone you feel really, really good about, but let's say, even if he has some injury issues like he did last year at a couple points for a week or two at a time, even if some of these younger guys don't pop immediately, we think all of those pieces put together gives us an elite secondary, and then that should really help our pass rush even more. If you can cover on the back end and make the quarterback pump fake, make the quarterback move his feet, make the quarterback hold the ball, that's going to give Matt Judon and company that much more time to get to the quarterback. So it's clear for after the longest time of this team talking about building from the inside out, at the very least, they've shifted a little bit, and that's they still have strong defensive linemen. They wanted to, and tried to re-sign C.J. Mosley, so it's not as though they completely ignored inside linebacker, but it's very clear that they've kind of shifted a little bit from saying, all right, instead of maybe having the most dominant front seven, we'll have a solid to good front seven, and we're going to have a dominant secondary, and we think that dominant secondary is going to make our front seven that much better. So I think if you've paid attention the last few years, you've seen this shift ever so slightly, and it hasn't worked out perfectly. I mean, they had some signings on the back end of the defense that didn't work out. So it's not as though every move's going to be perfect, but philosophically, I think you've seen them emphasize more and more of their secondary play over the last few years, and we started to see them really, it started 2 years ago, I'd say, but really last year started to bear the fruits of having a really strong secondary and having a pass defense that didn't necessarily intercept a ton of passes last year, but you look at the numbers and it speaks for itself how that secondary was able to play over the course of the season.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net, talking Ravens, getting some Orioles in here, getting some post-race stuff in here, and certainly some Baltimore positive. We're back out at State Fair in Catonsville on the 30th with UMBC President Freeman Rabowski. We're putting together a schedule for June, July, August, Don Moeller and I. BaltimorePositive.com. You'll be hearing a lot of it this week, as well as some throwback stuff and some current stuff as we get ready for the holiday. Also, Full Circle Tire and Auto. We get so many new sponsors. Dave is not a new sponsor. He's an old sponsor. It's a new sponsor that's back with us. All of our auto repair, Nasty Van, going back in the old days, Dave has done this work for us up in Harford County. Tires, more tires, 38 brands in stock. They also do a 1995 oil change. And if you need to service your AC, Dave's got you covered. First, Full Circle Tire and Auto, 2133 North Fountain Green Road, 410-676-CARS. 410-676-CARS. I found myself in a jam once. Dave gets us out of jams. Make sure you like Full Circle Tire and Auto out on Facebook as well. State Fair's also with us over in Catonsville. I'm telling you about the waffles and the chicken and waffles and the Benedicts and all the great stuff they have, including dinners. They got those fantastic Italian lights out there at nighttime. Stop by, get a brewski. See them at State Fair. We'll see you on Thursday, the 30th, 9 a.m. We're doing a little earlier. Bring your UMBC gear as well. Big shout out to Lee Tessier and the Lee Tessier team for helping me sell my condo, helping other folks buy their home, their dream home, their starter home, wherever you are. You need a realtor when you're out shopping for real estate. 'Tis the season. Lee Tessier's my guy. We got to know him during my wife's leukemia journey. They're also great folks up there in Harford County. Find them at leetessier.com. Luke, last thing on the Ravens, and I guess this is sort of a little bit of a testament to where we are with Eric DeCosta at this point and doing all the work during Preakness week, and the Orioles are losing ball games and can't get a hit, and all this other stuff that's going on with them. But this is the quiet season, and this is when we expect the Ravens to be doing the things the Ravens do, which is tinkering with the roster, making the team better. But signings in May, we're not used to that. It's a different kind of offseason with all the departures we've had that a lot of times we don't spend this time of the year wondering who the Ravens are going to sign. I think we've spent the last 4 months sort of in that, is today the day they're signing Ziggy Ansah? What are they doing on getting sandwich picks for next year and who's coming and who's going? There's been a whole lot of that this year. That's been unusual to have 3 guys sign Preakness week around here.
It usually is. I mean, they've signed some guys. I mean, Darryl Smith comes to mind. Jeremy Maclin comes to mind as far as some recent examples. But you're right. The volume of signing 3 guys in mid-May, I think that is a little surprising. But I think and the Ravens have been ahead of the curve in this regard, but I think you're seeing teams all catch up on this. We saw more movement. Why? Because of the post-May 7th deadline for the compensatory pick formula. I mean, we talked about it a lot. I mean, whether it was Ziggy Ansah, and I mean, there are even some guys out there now that aren't necessarily fits for the Ravens per se, but guys out there that are still available because teams did not want to pay those particular players at their asking price with the thought of having to give up, to sacrifice something as far as the compensatory pick formula goes. So I think you're seeing a little more movement in that regard. We've talked about these principles in baseball with the sandwich picks and qualifying offers a lot in recent years, but I think football, you're seeing that a little bit more with teams valuing draft picks, teams valuing compensatory picks, and I think that's why you've seen a little more movement. And the other factor here is the Ravens have had more cap space this time of year than they typically have had in recent years. Recent years, they were already at a point where they've spent all they had to spend other than their rookie pool and to have a few $1 million for your rainy day fund, so to speak, when guys get hurt in the regular season and you need to go sign some street free agents to fill out your roster or to add to your practice squad. So I think there is a different dynamic here, and I think Eric DeCosta very clearly, even with the financial flexibility, the cap flexibility to go out and sign free agents, the Ravens showed some restraint, and their thought was, yeah, we can go out and sign some free agents in March. I mean, they did that with Mark Ingram and Earl Thomas, and with Justin Bethel. But beyond that, it was really a case of looking for guys who were cut and then waiting until after the May 7th deadline to sign a couple more. And that's what we saw the Ravens do. So we'll see how it ultimately plays out. I mean, again, these three guys that they signed, I'm not sure any of them individually moves the meter dramatically. In fact, I mean, we didn't spend any time talking about Michael Floyd, really. I think Michael Floyd probably, I would say, is more long shot than lock to make the team. I mean, he's certainly a guy who's going to have to prove himself, and I think if he makes the team, you ask, how are the young receivers developing this summer? So, but the point is, more competition, some guys who have been successful in the past. Can they recapture that? Is there a specific role they can fill? I already said, if Pernell McPhee's on this football team, I don't expect him to be a guy who plays more than 15 or 20 snaps a game. But if he can come in and rush from an interior spot and push the pocket and maybe pick up 3, 4, 5 sacks and do some nice things for you that way, then that signing is a major win. But if he looks like he's done this summer and his knees are shot and he's not even the guy he was in Chicago a couple years ago, then you know what? It was a one-year deal with minimal financial commitment. So that's what these guys are. I mean, they're more than flyers. I don't want to just say that you're just taking a flyer because that indicates that they're a really, really low percentage type guys. They're not camp bodies, but they're competition, and they're guys that you hope have something left to contribute, and at the very least, they motivate some of your young guys from being complacent and just assuming that come Sundays they're going to be in the rotation, or even come the end of preseason they're going to be on the football team. They're going to have to earn their spot. So there's going to be plenty of competition here, and I think you could do a lot worse than the guys that they signed at the end of last week to add some competition to that mix, specifically with McPhee and Ray. I think there's definitely some upside there with Ray specifically, McPhee as far as the skill set being a little more unique, and then with Michael Floyd, I mean, the big knock on him the last few years, his sobriety. I mean, he's had problems with alcohol. He had a extreme DUI that led to his release in Arizona, and he had another alcohol issue at one point early on with his tenure with Minnesota, and just hasn't been very productive the last couple of years. Now, is that because of alcohol? Is that because of age? Is that because he's just kind of reached to the end of his window of being a contributor in the NFL? Who knows? But take a look, and the first sign of trouble or first sign of him not being good enough, he'll probably be gone. So, again, competition is a good thing. The especially when you're counting on young guys to step forward. In a perfect world, you don't necessarily need both McPhee and Ray. And Tyus Bowser and Tim Williams step forward and have great preseasons, and they come in and they play in the fall, and they look like the second and third round picks that they were a couple years ago. But if that doesn't happen, you're hoping these guys can help you out from a pass rushing standpoint. So there's no downside to this. There's only upside. I don't know if it's dramatic upside with these guys, but you'll take that, especially in May and especially for minimal financial commitment.
He's Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. Get you ready for Ravens mandatory camps coming up here. Guys pushing weights around. We're seeing guys around town. We've had Preakness going on around here and really, really bad baseball. All of our WNST coverage brought to you by our friends at Cole Roofing and Gordy and Energy. That's all of our Baltimore positive stuff. We had both Bill Coles on last week, one trying to save the racetrack and the other trying to help me save the world. Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. The coffee in your cup. I was really, really hungry on Friday night before the race, and I didn't even feel like walking to Royal Farms, so I drove to Key Highway. I gassed up, picked me up a chicken box. I ate the roll. I dipped the Western fries in the gravy. Thank you, Royal Farms. I also got some Ben & Jerry's ice cream, too. Strategic Factory, I'm about to get some Baltimore positive swag, like I have our tablecloth for our events. And by the way, we're at State Fair with Freeman Rabowski on the 30th in Catonsville. Strategic Factory hooked us up with that, hooked me up with this cup that I drink my energy drinks out of here on the air, but also creating your masterpiece. Hats, shirts, any kind of swag, anything that gets printed, anything that makes your company better and the strategy that goes along with it. It's Strategic Factory. We are also airing their phenomenal jingle, so make sure you're listening for that. Pizza John's, I was there on Thursday for lunch with my man Ruffin from Coppin State. We're looking forward to another big year of a Coppin State partnership around here. Pizza John's, we had a half pizza because Peter DeLutis only likes cheese. I don't know who goes to Pizza John's and orders cheese pizza. Not I. Put some meat sauce on it, says Luke Jones. Pizza John's, 50 years. Always doing it great. I did not even get the cheesesteak. That was a mistake. I'll correct that this week. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I am on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Snapchat and Instagram and Baltimore Positive and anywhere you are on Facebook Live and our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.